What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Taliyah is a champion who began her development in June of 2015. She was designed by Ride Xenon, aka Daniel Klein, who led the champion design team who developed her. Her original concept was settled on quite quickly, but her gameplay design took a really long time to figure out, as did her animations. And Taliyah wasn't always going to be how she ended up, so join me today in taking a look back at her development to find out what Taliyah could have been. And throughout this video, I do have to give a big shout out to our man Daniel Klein, who has been a huge help for this video with all of his information and stuff that he's been sharing on social media, on the forums, and just everywhere. So everyone, go ahead and give him a follow on Twitter at Daniel Z Klein, and give him some love. And if you guys enjoy this video, hit that like button, and if you don't, hit that dislike. Anyway, Taliyah's development story begins with something that the champion designers call fantasy slotting. The League of Legends champion production team operates somewhat strictly on a cycle that dictates what types of champions are going to get made. This cycle contains every type of champion you could think of, and it exists in order to make it so that two champions that are similar don't end up being released at the same time. So for example, Riot will try to avoid working on two tanks at the same time, or 280 carries, or so on, and if they've made a certain type of champion recently, they will not do so again for a while. And from the need of the fantasy slotting cycle to contain a traditional AP caster mage, since it was a kind of champion that they haven't made for a really long time, about 2 years or so, Ride Xenon began the character that had the name of Tectonic Marvel during development, and started working on the potential ideas for that. And to start, they began by exploring areas of elemental magic, because that was something that really gave off the more traditional mage vibe that they were looking for. They brought the idea to the art team, who gave them this piece of concept art to choose from as an example. You can see in this piece we have the Stoneflower, the Storm General, Tectonic Marvel, Spite Mage, and the Thunderbird. They gave each idea a decent amount of thought to see what the potential was. Thunderbird was a cool concept, but the developers just weren't that excited about it, since it wasn't entirely unique because of Kennen. The Spite Mage was a character that would cast curses and hexes and bad things towards its opponents, and it was kind of a funny idea to have this super salty champion, but it just didn't fit the elemental theme. Tectonic Marvel was interesting, but it was a good example of what they didn't want their mage character to look like, to convey the personality that they wanted. And the Storm General had a similar problem to Thunderbird, but the Stoneflower was something that they thought was just awesome. They loved the character, and that pick instantly drew the designers towards the idea, and it worked out almost instantly. The idea of an Earth Mage was one that the designers liked a lot, since it was a super unique character, and they wanted to capture the personality of like this positive and optimistic young individual, who maybe isn't all that experienced and still has trouble controlling her powers. They wanted someone who was light and upbeat, not so much dark and intense, and that Stoneflower concept captured that perfectly. The writing team drafted up a sketch for her story titled The Sunrise Stone, and from there they knew for sure that they wanted to move forward with the character. After about only 1 week into the ideation phase, the Stoneflower's character design was pretty fleshed out, and the designers knew exactly what they wanted. It was just a matter of bringing that character to life. It usually takes 1 or 2 months for a champion to reach that point, but the character that would eventually become Taliyah fell into place quite naturally. And from there, work on the gameplay design began as the writers and artists began to complete her story, personality, and polish everything. As for her gameplay design, it began with a character known as Terrain Mage. He was a separate entity from the Stoneflower and was a previously cancelled champion that Riot had worked on for a little bit. And since he used a lot of the Earth Magic theme in sort of his abilities, it only felt natural to try and incorporate that on the Stoneflower as a starting point for the new design, and it's what they used for the first prototype. Terrain Mage had an ability that was a skill shot that would become empowered by ripping pieces out of a wall from Summoner's Rift and throwing it at the enemy, and this caused his gameplay to be all about finding fresh pieces of wall to rip out and throw at opponents, but it created the problem of gameplay that was kind of just a bit too simple. Either you were fighting in the jungle near a bunch of walls and you were just a total monster, or you were fighting in a place with no walls and were just kind of useless. But going off of that concept for the Terrain Mage, Ride Xenon wanted to take a little bit of a spin on the ability concepts that they had from the original Terrain Mage design, and he knew that it also was going to be super difficult to program and code, so just for the time being, so that he could playtest the character, he submitted this ability where she ripped up the ground instead of taking chunks out of the walls, but it actually ended up being super awesome, and all of the playtesters loved it, as the gameplay of deciding where to use up the ground and when and just how to cast the spell was something that everyone thought was super cool. It also fit really well thematically, and after polishing it up a little bit, it would go on to almost instantly become the design for her Q. From there, they went with that concept since the playtesters really liked it, and Ride Xenon designed a paper kit for her based on the idea of exhausted ground, which is what they called it at the time. Now it's called worked ground, and the kit looked like this. The passive called her to empower her next spellcast when standing on unexhausted ground, but it would then exhaust the ground under her for a decent period of time. Her Q was the same Q that she has today. Her W was an area of effect skill shot that damaged enemies hit and would root them in place if it was on unexhausted ground. Her E threw out a bunch of rocks and a fan fan-shaped kind of thing like Ash's volley, but a little bit smaller, and enemies hit would be damaged and slowed. And if the stone flower was on unexhausted ground, it would leash her to her opponent, and you could reactivate the ability to push them away or pull them towards you. But there was a set range, and if the opponent got outside of that, the leash would break. And the ultimate was called Earthquake, and it would cause tremors in a huge radius about the size of like a Trundle W, and it would cause damage, slow people in the area, as well as knocking them up for a split second every 1 second. And it would also rejuvenate all of the ground so that you could cast the empowered versions of her spells. And for the duration of her ultimate, which was 4 seconds, you could not exhaust the ground in that radius. And as well, enemies in the massive radius would be grounded, or crippled, whatever you want to call it, meaning that opponents could not use blinks or dashes while in it. And this paper kit was an interesting prototype since it was quite well fleshed out, but it proved to have just a few too many problems in playtesting. Overall, her worked ground mechanic in that kit proved to just be way too much. It was clear that the worked ground passive was something that really only wanted to influence the Q, and her ultimate in specific wasn't going to work out because the cripple or grounded mechanic needed to be something that was selective and possible to outplay, not just slapped on into one ginormous area. So they moved on from that design, but they would still keep the Q ability that they'd made, and the next ability they started working on was her passive. One version that they tested out was called Stone Casket. After standing still for 3 seconds, she would surround herself with a layer of stone that would regenerate health and mana rapidly, but her vision radius would also be reduced to pretty much nothing, and she wouldn't even be able to see her allies. During this Stone Casket effect, any damage from an enemy would interrupt this ability and stun her for 1 second. And that passive didn't really work out, and instead, as to how her passive came to be, we have to bring it back a little bit. For the pre-season to Season 6, Riot experimented a bit with a bunch of different boot enchants, in an attempt to make the boot enchants feel more meaningful and more desirable as a purchase. These boot enchants pretty much all proved to be lackluster, at least the ones that they tested, and eventually Riot would decide that just straight up removing the boot enchants was a better idea. The only version of the alternate boot enchants that were being developed that showed at least a little bit of promise was an item that was called Terrain Boots. It never made it to live, but her eventual passive effect was just a total ripoff of that item, which would give you bonus movement speed while moving in certain types of terrain. And perhaps the most exciting part of her design is the story of her ultimate. So I mentioned the first version, which was from the exhausted ground prototype, but the second version of her ultimate was this super crazy ability that would allow the stone flower to target one piece of terrain on the map and just completely destroy it for 15 seconds. So someone could flash over a wall, and then you just destroy the wall with their ultimate and follow them. You could destroy entire base walls, the Baron Pit walls, and all sorts of stuff, and just walk right over. It was a super cool ability, but it didn't entirely make sense on the rest of her kit since she's a control mage. She wants to lock people in and create choke points rather than remove them. And it was also the case where this ability needed a ton of extra effort to actually make it work properly. It was predicted that the release of what would eventually become Talia would be delayed for approximately 6 more months if they decided to ship this ability in her kit. And they definitely were willing to delay her like that. It's just that the ability, although being super cool, was just totally out of place in her kit. Another version of her ultimate that they tested was a version of her current ultimate that she has now, of creating this super huge wall, but instead of being able to ride it to transport it around the map, you could reactivate the ability again to actually curve it. So you could curve the wall in a targeted direction, and it was a great ability that really fit well thematically of her being this stone weaver. But the problem was that it was really hard to get the right curve when you actually wanted it. It almost felt like you had to wrestle with the ability, so it didn't really feel all that good in practice and in playtesting. And the rock surfing aspect was something that was just super awesome, so they put that on the ultimate instead. And for her W, it began as an ability from an Azir prototype by Riot Gypsy Lord from January 2014. The ability was called Rupture Toss at the time, and it was designed during the Azir Hackathon kind of event that took place during his development. They knew from that event that it would be a cool ability, and although it definitely didn't fit on Azir, Riot Gypsy Lord continued to pitch the ability to almost everyone since he thought it was just so damn awesome. It was originally tested out in a more extreme version and actually as her ultimate, and they knew that the ability would fit well in her kit, just that it had to be a basic ability instead, so they toned it down and they put it on her W. For her E, they wanted to really accomplish the feel of like weaving stone and being a stone weaver, so one of the abilities they tried involved stitching walls together. It was a skill shot that was only able to fire through another wall that would actually create a wall itself, but only if the projectile touched another wall on the other side. It was a really cool spell that created some super interesting gameplay revolving around walls, but it was something that didn't entirely make sense on a mid-laner mage, but maybe it has some potential on like a jungler. And eventually they settled upon the concept of something that resembled the weave of like a piece of cloth, and incorporated that into an ability that would eventually become her E. And for a large portion of her development, her auto attack was an animation that was like a trail of rocks that would get ripped up from the ground. This was deemed to be too visually powerful for an auto attack, and it was difficult to follow and know when the damage would land since the particle was just kind of wonky. So they switched it to something that looked and felt more like a needle and thread to fit alongside the whole weaving kind of theme going on. Once all the abilities were complete, they began the process of figuring out her in-game animations. The biggest goal they had with her visual effects was to capture this chaotic nature of her spellcasts, as if she's barely able to control her powers, and they figured out how to do this by making her ultimate intentionally tuned to feel like it was just way too fast, as if she's not totally in control of what's going on. As well, they really wanted to keep the whole weaving aspect of the whole stone weaving concept in her design as a way to bring her character to life in the gameplay. One of the versions they attempted for that idea was giving her like a spool kind of accessory that she would use to gather rocks and then unleash them on the enemies. And although that fit well thematically, it didn't really make sense with her gameplay since it was something more suited for abilities with a charge-up time. And eventually they settled upon what they have now in a way that almost downplays her power in a sense. She's just a 16-year-old girl who's still learning stuff, she's rough and she's messy, and that personality is reflected well in her gameplay elements. And from there they had just about everything fleshed out and would go on to give her a more sophisticated name and complete Thalia after some polish and tweaks. Thalia took about 11 months to develop from start to finish without even counting the development time it took to develop the stuff they stole from. Zir's ability, the terrain boots, and the terrain mage concepts. Overall, she's done a great job of really capturing the control mage style, and her personality and design worked out quite well. She's a super cool champion, and I'm really excited to see what happens with her now that she's hit the live servers. And looks like that's going to be it for me. Thank you so much for watching, subscribe if you want, and I'll see you guys next time.